When I was getting ready for this, the thing that just kept crossing my mind was the end of Jesus, and you guys know it, so it's not of any shock for me to read it necessarily. But I was just thinking of the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus talked about when he says, "Everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter." And it's exactly what we have in Saul. Saul is a man who is concerned only with appearance of looking like he's doing the will of God, and yet in reality, as we're going to see today, because now it's really all going to fall off, he doesn't care about God's will. And therefore, we have very obviously an unbeliever in the person of Saul, which is sad. Obviously his death is coming, and his judgment after death is coming, and we know that, and we can kind of separate ourselves from it because it's some person in the Bible we've never met, but this is still true today. There will be many people who claim that they know God or that they follow God, and maybe their life looks like they possibly maybe follow God, but in reality, there's a whole lot of shady stuff going on behind doors and things happening behind in closets and all that kind of stuff. Because the reality is that who you are in secret is who you really are. Who you are just before God is who you really are. And Saul is going to do secretive things in this section here, and it shows again who he really is, why he can't be the king of Israel anymore, why God has rejected him, not just as the king, but also in his soul as well. He didn't want to do the will of God, and he didn't care about heaven. So that's what I was thinking when I got to this today. I was working on it. And David is not perfect by any means. We've got some problems here at the end of this as well, and we'll talk about that. But David still has a heart of God, and we see that heart for God, and God is kind to override a lot of his mistakes, and that's what God does with his saved people. We'll see that as well. So let me pray, just kind of get that rolling in our heads before we get going with the end of 1 Samuel, and then we will, let me pray, then we'll review, and then we'll get into it, okay? Father, thank you for our time tonight, and pray you'd bless it, the teaching of your word. You'd help me speak accurately and help in a helpful way, that I be clear with what your word actually says, and that if there's things that come up that are not right or true, and they would just be dismissed out of our minds and be gone, and we would just cling to the things that are true and that stick to your word. Help us to think well tonight, be good Bereans. Help us to love your word more and more, because it talks about you, so that we may love you and follow you even closer and find the joy of our salvation. And pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so remember, the purpose of Samuel Kings and Chronicles is that we have a piece of history here. I do have slides for this. Slide. There it goes. Proven history. It did happen in time. You can go there still to some of these places. It is an example for us. Things that happened in the past, Romans 15:4, are meant for us, so that as we read them and understand them, then we can learn from both the good examples and the bad examples. And sometimes those good and bad examples come from the exact same person. So they're there for our teaching. It also points us to Jesus. Ultimately, as David, as good as he is at times, he never is as faithful as Jesus, which is why we don't follow David, we follow Jesus. And but it points us in that direction. And then finally, and this again is going to come up, it's just going to keep coming up, a reminder that God is sovereign. That he is the one over all these things, and he is the one ruling in all these ways, and he is able to rule over evil men, over godly men, over decisions that are made, good and bad, to accomplish his purposes, and nothing will get that off track. And again, we see that today. The history leading up to Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, of course, Genesis 1 through 11, creation, fall, flood, the first covenant, Noahic covenant, and nations. We then have the Abrahamic covenant, which is now going to be Israel's covenant perpetually. Nothing they need to do. God's going to bless them. He's going to give them land eventually, and he's going to curse anybody who curses them. Exodus and Deuteronomy, there's freedom from Egypt. God gives his law to Israel after he saves them out of Egypt, and that first generation rejects God. They're replaced by the second generation, and he gives the Mosaic covenant at that time, the covenant through Moses, a temporary covenant that ends with Christ in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. And of course, this is that bilateral covenant that if Israel is obedient, God blesses. If they're disobedient, then God will curse them. In Joshua and Judges, Israel enters the promised land, they conquer it, they divide it up, but then they descend back into sin, and they just have to be regularly rescued by judges, military leaders. By the time we get to the end of Judges, everybody's doing what is right in his own eyes. We need something like a king. And so the book of Samuel comes along to give us that transition from God ruling alone to God ruling through a king. And that's what we see throughout this. And just as we walk through the basic outline, we see the early life of Samuel. So Samuel now needs to replace Eli because Eli and his family are terrible leaders for Israel. So Samuel comes in to take that role. We see that the people are not trusting God truly in chapters 4 through 7. They're just using him as like a good luck charm. And that is a lesson they have to learn from the ark travels. And then they reject God ultimately and say, we want a king like the nations. We want somebody who will fight all our battles. And so by rejecting God and rejecting God's prophet, God gives them the king according to their heart, according to their desires, and that is Saul. First 2 years seems to start out pretty well for Saul. That actually is going to come back up here at the end of this 1 Samuel. But by the time we get to chapter 13, we find out that he is more self-absorbed than we realized. He's more about himself and about his kingdom and not about God's. He wants to do things his way and keep face. He wants to save face in front of everybody and give the appearance, what I have called in the past performance-only belief. So long as people are looking, I will look like I believe. But when I'm in my closet, when I'm on my own, when I'm in my bedroom by myself, then that's really you. But he was caught doing these things and multiple times, so he forfeits his crown. So then we say, who's going to replace this guy? Who is better than Saul? And that's where David comes in. And this is a huge pivot point in chapter 6 in the narrative because our hero enters the scene. And the rest of the book then goes on to talk about how does a shepherd boy go to being the king of Israel. And this rest of the book also goes on to contrast because he is meant to be better than Saul. We have to contrast the difference between Saul and David. And where that's going to come out is right up front in chapter 16, verse 7. The verses you know really well, but one just need to have ingrained into your mind. Yahweh said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks at the heart. God cares about what's going on internally and not the external. The external will have its place so long as your heart is doing what it's supposed to. Last week, then, we looked at David the fugitive. This is the movement of David's life throughout the land over basically during his 20s. Saul wants to kill him. He doesn't want him to be the next king. He's jealous. Tries to kill David multiple times. David has a chance to kill Saul multiple times and does not. David has good days and bad days throughout his time traveling around the land. And the text ends in chapter 27 with David hiding out in Philistine territory. Do I have a map? Do I have a map back there? I do. Cool. So just keep that up for a sec. Actually, it probably doesn't even show where I'm trying to get to. It doesn't. Further down, you see Gath at the bottom. Further down is Ziklag. That's where he's at. While he's down there, he's attacking all these Canaanite lands and basically building up a reputation with the Judites down in the south. And he has to tell King Achish, because King Achish is asking what happened today. This is verse 10 of chapter 27. And David has to lie to King Achish to tell him that he's raiding against the Israelites, when in reality he's raiding against the Canaanites. And so he's put himself in a real bad position. David is justifying this because he's trying to build some political clout. He knows he's going to be the future king, and so he's trying to build a reputation with Judah and Benjamin in the south, and it'll be an easier transition that he sees, yes, I'm going to protect all of you. And that is what happens, by the way. Later on in chapter 30, the last portion of it, after David does gain a lot of their trust, the problem is this almost backfires on David. And that's the beginning of chapter 28. David has done such a good job down south that Achish, they're going to head up to do battle up at the top, follow the red line, forget the purple line and the yellow line. Those are worthless to you. Just follow the Christmas lines, red and green. The red line is they're going to go up to battle against Saul and the Israelites, and Achish, the Philistine king, wants David's help. So look at it just at the beginning of chapter 28, verse 1. Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. Problem. And Achish said to David, "Know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men." And David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." So Achish said to David, "Very well, I'll make you my bodyguard for life." Now what does he do? He can't stop working for Achish, and so he's got to start thinking of a plan, but we got a big old problem. The Philistines, they resolved here, as I said, another assault against Israel. And I don't know if they were encouraged because of the obvious instability of now the older Saul has been on the throne now 40 years. Maybe David's apparent shift in allegiance, which wasn't really, but it looked that way. There could be another reason, we don't know. But they felt like this was a prosperous time. And so David finds himself in a compromising position, and he would be called to demonstrate his loyalty by fighting against his own people. And what's going to happen? And you just have to wait till chapter 29 to find out. There's good drama in the Bible here, okay? Because we interrupt this program to go talk about King Saul, right? So you have this problem over here with Achish and David. What's David going to do? And the writer of this decides to say, just hold on to that. Let's go over to Saul for a minute. So that's where chapter 28, and this is where we get into our outline, where we see Saul's end. It begins with Saul going to visit a witch. And that's our outline up there. There you go, a witch. I'm not a witch, I'm your wife. Not that kind of person. And this story is filled with all kinds of irony. It's really odd, because people want divine guidance, but I'm just thinking of this in more of our time and I. People want divine guidance, but they reject the Bible. People want supernatural help, but they don't seek God, nor trust Him, nor ask Him for help on a regular basis. People want information, or they want intimacy, even from the deceased, but they ignore those people while they're alive. People want a comfort for the present and assurance regarding the future, but they refuse to learn anything from the past. People ignore God, disobey God, blaspheme God, even curse God, but when they're actually desperate, when they're actually afraid, when the world falls apart, when they're in real need, they clutch their face in their hands and they ask God to do something. And it's ironic. But that's what Saul did. God exists in Saul's mind, but is only there to be a genie to get him out of trouble. Otherwise, I can do life on my own. I don't need God. And that is our culture. You guys know that. Live however you want, in the way you want, however you feel. define your own life, live by your own rules, call your own shots, don't ask for help because no one's going to be there to help you anyway. Occasionally give a quick shout out to God, when you hit a baseball or something. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as it feels right, you're good to go. And the only time you actually need God is when you're desperate. But he probably isn't going to help anyway. So maybe I don't even need to do that. And that's our culture, isn't it? It's sad. Here's the God of creation, the God of the universe, who owns everything, who made all men and women after his own image, and he has told them that the best life is walking in his ways and only in his ways, and yet they have the audacity to thumb our nose at God and tell him, my way is best. Well, this text shows how desperately we do need God and that he is the only option. Without God, there's no hope, there's no help. In God and God alone, there is every answer. Saul is going to seek out answers elsewhere, but not from God, because his life is not seeking God's way. And the only answer he receives is hopeless and helplessness. To summarize all of chapter 28, Saul, who faces fear and desperation due to that impending Philistine attack that we saw on the map, he seeks guidance from God initially, but receives no answer, and there's a reason for that. And so in his distress, he consults a medium, that is a witch, in Endor, to summon a spirit, and that spirit is the deceased prophet Samuel, and Samuel delivers a prophecy of doom, telling Saul that he and his sons are going to die the next day. It's such a weird story. Let me give you some details with that. Verse 3 gives two reminders. First off, Samuel is dead. We could see that. Now Samuel is dead. And you're like, why do we need to know this? The reason you need to know that is because it's important for the story. Saul has also removed, as you see verse 3, Saul removed from the land who were mediums and spiritists. Why would you need to mention that? Because it's important to the story, okay? Verse 4, the Philistines are then ready to attack. The Philistine army, you can bring that map back up. The Philistine army was in Shunem, which is 15 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee. It was strategic and gave them an extreme advantage. So you can see the Dead Sea's down over here. The Sea of Galilee is up over there. Nazareth would be straight over. And most of Jesus' ministry would be up there. But they're sitting up there. You can see Endor up there, and you see Shunem. And their plan was to fight on the plain of Esdraelon, which is right in the middle of all of that. And the reason for that is because it was flat. Chariots could move fairly easily. It's part of the main trade route of the area. So basically, they're cutting off the northern tribes from the southern tribes is what they're trying to accomplish. And Saul got his troops to Mount Gilboa. Wait, what happened to my map? Mount Gilboa, which is the bottom portion of that green line, or the top of the green line. And so they're sitting there. And Saul, verse 5, saw this developing, and verse 5, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. Verse 6, for the first time in a long time, then Saul cried out to Yahweh. And communication at that time was done one of three ways. It was either done by dreams, the Urim, or in the prophets. Well, Saul is not sleeping well, so the dreams are not going to happen. Saul, back in chapter 22, killed all the prophets, except for one, Abiathar. Abiathar, in chapter 22, left that whole massacre and ran down as he's with David. So you're not going to hear from any priests. And then lastly, his last experience, Samuel has already left him, chapter 15. And in chapter 19, he had a bad experience with the prophets. Remember, that was that 3 waves of trying to get David, and they end up prophesying, and then Saul comes himself. It's a funny scene and all that, but that's the last time he dealt with prophecy. In other words, all the normal communication with God has already been cut off from Saul long before this moment. And it's because Saul refused to listen to God. And so now, in his moment of desperation, near the end of his life, there's no way he's going to hear from God again. Saul has established the pattern of not heeding God's instruction. But in a crunch, he inquires of the Lord, hoping for further instruction, which again is very common for us. People who have no intention on obeying God, no intention of following him, they pray only when they hit rock bottom, but God is not going to answer them because they have no intention on following him afterwards. The Bible is clear that a person can reach a point of no return. Do I have Proverbs up there? I think I do. If you can read all that, that's cool. But listen to what Proverbs 1 says. Starting in verse 24, because I called and you refused, I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel. This is wisdom talking, but God is obviously the person of wisdom, but this is talking about that as well. You neglected all my counsel and are not willing to accept my reproof. I will also laugh at your disaster. I will mock when your dread comes like a storm and your disaster comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me earnestly, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and they did not choose the fear of Yahweh. They were not willing to accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat of the fruit of their way and be satisfied with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fool will destroy them. And we rebuff against this because what about a loving God? And well, God is loving and he gives instruction over time throughout life. But if you continue to shove away his instruction, continue to push away his word, then God will push you away. Because that's what you wanted to begin with. And so that's what you got. And so all of a sudden you're crawling back to him because you're at bottom. You don't really care. You just want to get out of this situation. God is not going to answer. And it's going to feel like he laughs at your disaster and mocks you because you had all this beforehand. Why didn't you take it now? So that's where Saul's at. God will not talk to Saul. He will not communicate because Saul has spent the last 38 years of his life rejecting God. So, verse 7, he commands that a witch be found, which is weird, right? It just said in verse 3 that Saul got rid of all the mediums and all the spiritists. So, and that was the right thing to do, by the way. The Mosaic Covenant, Leviticus 19:13, says, do not turn to mediums or spiritists. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am Yahweh your God. He repeats it again for the second generation in Deuteronomy 18. Gives a little more instruction then. The point is you must never dabble around in spiritual things outside of God's instruction. No ancestor worship. No child sacrifice, no death rituals, no ancestor stuff, no perverse customs. All of that is the realm of Satan, demons, evil. God communicates with his people through his word everything you need to know. Yes, there's more questions. God is omniscient. We are not. There's a lot more to come, okay? But God has given us everything we need to know. We don't need more answers. We don't need to employ other means to discover, not really discover because it won't work, things that God has not chosen to reveal. In the Old Testament in particular, but it does roll into the New Testament, illegitimate forms of discovering God's voice are like necromancy, which is what's going to happen here, consulting with the dead, haptoscopy, which is looking into the liver of an animal. These are all mentioned in the Old Testament. I don't know why you'd want to look into a liver of an animal, but that's what they were trying. Belomancy, which was watching arrows fall in various ways when you drop them. Teraphim, which is consulting with ancestral images. Ezekiel 21 talks about some of this. Astrology, of course, we know probably in our culture, consulting with the heavenly bodies. hydromancy, which is watching how an object floats in either by itself or on the inside of a cup, and rhabdomancy, which is using a divine rod to find materials or metals in the ground, the whole stick thing. Okay, so all these ways are mentioned in the Old Testament as messing around with things outside of what God has given instruction. And we need to avoid those as well. But now Saul wants a witch for answers. And before the verse even ends, look at verse 7. The servant said, "Behold, there's a woman in Endor." What in the world? Saul, I thought you got rid of all these witches and all these spiritists. Apparently not. Apparently he had kept a few around, just in case he needed them. So was he actually obeying what God had said by getting rid of them? Well, it may have looked like it near him, but he knew where to find them immediately. This is, again, the desire of appearance. Public appearance the public proclamation gets rid of all the witches, but they're still hiding in secret. Sounds like our government, doesn't it? It was never about holiness, and now he's exposed. And desperation does this, by the way. Trials do this. Desperation trials expose us for who we really trust, ourselves or God. We may look like we follow God, that we're upstanding moral people, but when safety or our standard of living is threatened, we are exposed. We get mad, we get upset, we go run to things we shouldn't run to. That's what happened here to Saul. And Saul even knows it's wrong. That's the weird part, because verse 8, he disguises himself. And go back to that map. And he has to go through the Shunan army to get to Endor. He's got to go through the Philistines to go find out what he thinks God is going to tell him. He puts his life on the line. And then, once he gets there, this is awful, verse 10. Once he gets there, she's like, "Are you laying a snare for me?" And Saul says in verse 10, "As Yahweh lives, no punishment will come upon you for this thing." He swears by Yahweh's life that nothing bad will happen to her. I mean, he is so far gone at this point. "I swear to God that if you help me break God's law, you will not be punished." Saul has just zero regard for God at this point. He doesn't care. He's a hypocrite. Verse 11, Saul wants to speak with Samuel, which is odd, again, because Saul didn't really seem to care much about Samuel's guidance while alive. And again, it's just sad how people do this even today. We live in a country with the Word of God everywhere, and people are not interested. They just waste their life on everything else. And Saul wasted his. Verse 12 and 14, it's weird. Calling up Samuel works. Samuel appears. It scares the witch, which this is part of the reason why this is probably Samuel. She normally just has to work her tricks, bring in a guy that kind of maybe looks like Samuel and do some hocus pocus and some smoke and all that, and boom, we got something. But here Samuel happens and she is scared to death. And of course we have to ask the question, is this really Samuel? Is this just something else? Is it a demon? There's lots of options. I'll let you go read all that stuff. I have no reason to believe that it wasn't Samuel back from the dead for this moment, mainly because it's just what the text simply says. The medium was surprised, as I said. She did not expect this to work, and it did. It's none of her people. Secondly, Saul bows down in respect, and that would be very weird to do if this was some kind of odd impersonation. Thirdly, Samuel's message was clearly from God, and demons are not exactly ones to tell the truth, so this can't be the devil's message, because what he says is what comes true. And then fourthly, the text itself says in verse 14, it was Samuel. And I don't know how much more clear you need other than that. I mean, we could go to the Jesus transfiguration. We see that Elijah and Moses showed up there, so this is not a weird thing necessarily. And then just simply ask, why couldn't God do this? You know, if God wants to do this, he could do this. It's not hard for him. The question that could be asked is, why would God do this? He can do it, but why would he? Why would he use a witch that is condemned in his law with a running and disobedient king to communicate his message? Why would God do this? And the answer is, I have no idea, because the text doesn't say. But we can say that God is sovereign and that he is permitted to even use evil pursuits to get his message across. He is more than welcome to do that. And he does it here. That does not mean we should pursue evil things in order to hear from God. Some people have taken it that way. They are heretics. Do not do that. The point is, God can and sometimes does use at his discretion very odd things and people to get his message out. Again, do not pursue these things. That's evil. But God can use it. That's his sovereignty that overrules that. So this is not demons. This is not sorcery. This is not witchcraft. This is divine intervention with a little bit of divine humor wrapped into divine judgment. All in one. Now, verses 15 through 19, Saul basically says, Samuel, God won't speak to me. What do I do? And Samuel's like, you never listened to God before. Why would he do it now? But his message hasn't changed anyway. You have rejected God. His spirit is gone from you. You are cursed. God is not going to help. You've rejected him. He's rejected you. Tomorrow you will die. See you later. Actually, you won't see him later, but bye. It's all very hopeless. That's the whole message. Hopeless, helpless. It's terrible for Saul. But that is the wage of rejecting God. The wage of rejecting God is that God rejects you. In 1 Chronicles 10, I think I have it up on the board there, it makes this note. Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he committed against Yahweh. And what were those two things? Because of the word of the Lord, which he did not keep. Doesn't that sound like Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount? And also because he asked counsel of a medium. So 1 Samuel 13 and 28 are the great sins of Saul's life. Those two texts explain his whole life. He did not listen to the word of God, and he consulted with a witch. Now he's, of course, beside himself. He's terrified and all that. And this woman, who is a witch, feels some level of compassion on Saul. And she's a lot more scared of what's going on than apparently he is. But she makes him a kingly meal. And it's irony. It's irony. Saul's final meal is made by a witch. So it ends in despair. Because Saul, you're going to die. Now, back to chapter 29. Back to the story. Remember, we left David off over here with Achish. So we know what's going to happen to Saul. Chapter 29 actually backs up again a couple days before chapter 28. And simply, the Philistine leaders question David's loyalty as he prepares to fight against the Israelites. They have meetings and such, and they talk about it. And ultimately, by God's grace, the kings all reject David, fearing that he might turn on them in battle. And so they're not going to let him come up. And so Achish, the Philistine king, sends David back to his home in Ziklag, thus preventing any conflict. Isn't that cool? I named this section David Rejected, Rescued, ? Because David's rejection by the Philistine leaders is really his rescue. This is David, or God delivering David from a very nasty problem that David got himself into, but God is good about delivering us time and time again from our own stupidity. This is God's sovereign grace, overruling our stupidity for his glory and for our good. A great example of God's sovereign control over evil men. And again, this is in opposition to the end of chapter 29, which is very short, just 11 verses. You end with sort of this hope. They get to leave, and they don't have to make hard decisions about fighting Israelites. And so you kind of end up with hope, which again is opposite than 28. You end 28 on this big downer because Saul's going to die now, and this is finally, we're getting to this. And with chapter 29, you're like, oh, hope for David. This is great. Until chapter 30. Here is where David has to go on the rescue in chapter 30 because he needs to rescue the people of Ziklag. So David and his men return to their town in Ziklag, and they find it burned, and their families all have been taken captive by the dumb Amalekites. The Amalekites again, which should never have happened. Remember, the Amalekites should have been done with in chapter 15. But here they are again. And then after seeking God's guidance, again, something that David actually does throughout his life, not perfectly, but he does better than Saul did. So here's that contrast between Saul and David. David pursues the Amalekites. He goes back north again. I'll show you that in a minute. And defeats them, successfully recovers all that's lost, and he shows leadership, faith, and all that. So a few notes in chapter 30. Remember, the Amalekites were still a problem. They've been a problem since Exodus 17 when they attacked Israel on Israel's journey through the wilderness. God promised to wipe them out. God gave Saul the command to do so in 1 Samuel 15. Saul didn't do it, which is part of the reason he was rejected as king. And so now we continue to have problems. See, sin has further reaching arms than you ever realize. And so from the Amalekites' point of view, they know Israel's distracted with the Philistines. And so why not take advantage of a vulnerable and defenseless city in Ziklag? There's only women and children left, easy targets. And when when David and his men saw the smoke in verse 3, of course they assumed the worst. And it sends them into a weeping frenzy to the degree that they wept until there was nothing left to weep. I don't know if you've ever done this. Cried until there's nothing left to cry. Even though you're still in tears, and you're like metaphorically in tears, but you got nothing left. That's where they were at. This was the worst. And by the way, weeping from a disaster is a good response. It's not weakness to cry, especially over hard things like this, because sometimes weeping is all you can do, okay? Not to mention these guys are like ridiculously tired. Show me that map again. From Aphek, which is where they were, which is right in the middle there, okay? And all the way down to Ziklag was a 60-mile hike. 60 miles is a long walk, okay? It's twice the length of Northwest Arkansas. It'd be like walking from Bentonville to Fayetteville and then back again. That's a long walk. These guys are tired, and then they show up to this. And it hit David too, verse 5 of chapter 30. His family had also been taken captive, reminding us that just because you're a godly person doesn't mean you get out of disasters. Some of what our weather has shown recently and even last year. I also see Job. Job was a righteous man. He still got disasters. And in verse 6, now that they've wept enough, they got to blame somebody. This is just sort of natural within us. It's not right, but the Amalekites were the evil ones, but they're not there, so it's easier to blame what's right in front of you than to blame something that's really far away. And so they start blaming David for this, and they were embittered against him. But David, I love this, and you probably just, if you get a tattoo, maybe this is the right one to get. I don't know. Chapter 30, verse 6b. But David strengthened himself in Yahweh, his God. What a verse. Like that's your verse. That's your life verse right there. Whenever hardship comes up, strengthen yourself in your God. David was bitter and sad like everybody else. And he wasn't interested in blaming anybody. He was interested, listen, in God's presence. That's it. It's a really good application for us. Verses 7 through 9, David then goes to God, says, what's going on? What do we do? Tells them that you need to go after the Amalekites and gives them permission, and off they go. Remember, they just got off a 60-mile hike, and now they're going back at it. These guys. In verse 10, 200, they get to a place called the Brook of Besor. The men are exhausted. 200 of them are like, listen, leave your luggage here. We'll watch it. The rest of you go. Like, we can't do this anymore. So that's fine. The place they had to cross over was a steep river bed. It was very wide, very difficult. This is okay. Let them rest. We have enough. God already said we're going to win, so no big deal. Let's just take what we got and go. So David didn't need that many men. He knew that. Verses 11 through 15, God provides then a sick Egyptian who was with the Amalekites, but is sick, couldn't keep traveling, and God providentially put them there in order to find out what direction the Amalekites had gone off to. Again, God will provide the direction. When God wants you to go somewhere, he will provide even weird means, like a sick Egyptian, to get you where you need to go. Okay? It's a lesson that older believers learn pretty quickly and trust God sooner. Verse 16, the Amalekites, assumed that David was probably at war still. They didn't get the update that he was now relieved of duty and he was headed back to Ziklag. And so they're partying, they're having a good time, and they're not on their guard. They're that kid out in right field sitting down because the ball never comes out here anyway. Easy prey. And so they, verse 17, they attack. He strikes them, and they don't kill everybody. A bunch of them get away. But that's fine because that wasn't the goal. The goal was to get everything that they took at Ziklag back, which is exactly what they did. Everything that was taken by the Amalekites, verse 18, including his wives, they got it back. Nothing was missing. That's awesome. And so they load it all back up. Verse 21 and 22, they travel back down to the 200 that are at the Brook of Besor. And then some men who fought with David start arguing with the 200 that the 200 shouldn't receive any of the spoil or any of the things that belong to them because you guys wimped out and didn't come with us. And David or the text thankfully calls these men who are going after these 200, he calls them evil and vile men. Because what they were doing was evil and vile. It was wrong, what they were doing. And so David handles it really well. He handles it kindly. Verse 23, he says, "This must not do so, my brothers." They're all brothers together. So he starts with kindness. He then brings in, the end of verse 23, theology. With what God has given, who has kept us and given into our hands the band that came against us. In other words, it's God who got this back for you anyway. It wasn't you. And then he asserted his kingly authority. Verse 24, "And who will listen to you in this matter? For as is the portion of the one who goes down to battle, so the portion shall be the one who remains with the baggage. They shall be a portion together." So the one who protects the stuff is just as much as important as the fighter. Y'all are in this together, which will become a theme later on when it comes to evangelism and sending out missionaries. There are senders and there are stayers. There are senders and there are goers. And both are equally important. They're both necessary. You're here. You need to pray. You need to support the people who go. Okay? So that's where David is getting at. They're both important. Men, let's not live off of, I deserve this. I'm better than them. No, let's recognize the contribution that everyone has made and be gracious. The fact that we have everything back is a gift. Don't be focused on, I earned this. I did more work. No. Be sharing. Be kind. We're all brothers together. And this was all everybody's anyway. So the Lord gave it to us. Let's be kind. So in verses 26 and 31, obviously that ended it. He became a peacemaker, which is what we all need to do, but he's showing his kingliness. He's able to be a peacemaker with the people. And they get back and they shared all the blessings and goodness of God with everybody. And everybody gets back, and it's a real party because they're enjoying God's blessing. Just one note here on the very final verse of chapter 30. What city is named at the very end of this list? The city of... Are we looking at our Bibles? Hebron. Okay? Why is Hebron important? It's going to be the capital city of David before he moves it to Jerusalem. Okay? So it's important because this is where things are going to start. And so it's mentioned last because this is going to be HQ for a time. So we need to strengthen ourselves in the Lord. Remember his character. Remember his promises. Get theological. Okay? Quickly. Remind yourself and others, especially in disasters and toil and pain and even internal skirmishes, conflicts between people. Remind yourself, remind the people you're talking to, especially those who claim to follow God, who God is, what he has promised, and that he is gracious. Get theological very quickly, not because it shows how much you know, but because we need to follow the Lord together. All right, chapter 31, the last chapter. Only a little 13 verses. This is the tragic end of King Saul and his sons during the battle of the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. So we know that Saul is living on borrowed time. We know that because of chapter 28. It's not going to end well with him. But there are a few things to note here in chapter 31. First, Saul died the way he lived, okay? He was cowardly, he was faithless, and he was without God. He was only worried about appearance. And even in his death, he did not want the enemy to get credit. That's why he killed himself. So even in death, it was about appearance. Now, granted, he still didn't get that. They made sport of him. Verses 9 and 10, they cut off his head, stripped him of his weapons, sent all those around the land of the Philistines, proclaimed good news in the house of their idols, and to the people. They placed his weapons in the house of their Asheroth and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. So even after his death, he did finally receive shame. Notice in verse 2 who the first person to die was. The Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan. And your heart goes, oh. Right? Jonathan was a man. He was awesome. We have other sons as well here mentioned. But that one hurts. Because Jonathan was the best character even over David in this whole story. And yet he went down with his dad, showing both his faithfulness to his father, but also faithfulness to God's anointed, all the way to death. He served God till the end. It'll be fun to meet him someday. Verses 8 and 9, God's name, again, is dishonored by Saul's death. The Philistines thought they defeated Yahweh because of Saul's death. Saul's life and death brought shame to God. And I pray that we would all avoid such things, even if our death is tragic or painful, that we would stand firm following our God even to death and honor him even in our death. Verses 10 to 13, why did all of this happen? Hold on, what am I looking at? Oh yeah, not why did this happen. But then we find out something cool happens with the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. So look at the last couple verses of the book. Then the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul. So all the valiant men arose. They walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. And they came to Jabesh and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Why would the men of Jabesh Gilead make a risky raid to rescue Saul and his sons' bodies? This is a 22-mile round trip from Jabesh Gilead to Mount Gilboa. Why would they do this? You remember why? Remember what Saul did for Jabesh Gilead 40 years previous to this moment? This was back in chapter 11. Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh Gilead and threatened to destroy them unless they made a covenant with him. And the covenant he wanted to make with them was this: I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you and make you a reproach to all Israel, and you will serve me. Not a very good covenant. Well, that reached Saul's ears. This is the first year of his reign. And he rallied the men of Israel, 300,000 troops from Israel, 30,000 from Judah, and he went and smote the Ammonites to the degree that chapter 11, verse 11 says that not two Ammonites were standing next to each other. So he had saved them. He'd rescued them. And here we are now, 40 years later. And these valiant men remembered and they paid their respects. God did use Saul back in chapter 11, and the people honor him for that, even if the rest of his life was a total disaster. Honor where honor is due. And that's where this book ends. It ends in a very tough spot. Dead leadership. The enemy has won. Israel is sheep without a shepherd. Their only king is a massive failure. Israel itself has only itself to blame. Chapters 1 through 4, you had bad leadership in Eli. Chapters 8 and 12, you had the rejection of God and his prophet. Chapters 13 through 31 is a deterioration of the royalty. There's not really a lot to be excited about at the end of this book. It's been a mess in Israel. And from our view, it looks pretty abysmal. But thankfully, our view is not the final view, nor is it the whole view. Man can only see what's in front of him. God sees infinitely more. He also has more planned. And so the question at the end of 1 Samuel is, the questions, what will David do next? How will Israel respond? What is God's plan now? And that, you either have to read on your own, or you have to wait till the fall to find out. What can we walk away with? And just 4 simple things, I think. First one is, what did I write up there? Be a true follower of God, or avoid being a superficial follower of God. Truly follow him with your life. Don't follow only when it seems to fit your lifestyle or when you seem to benefit from it. See that God's way always understand that God's way always leads to life. Even when others scoff at you, even when others want to kill you for it, and even when God brings difficulties into your life. God's way always is life. And David writes about this in multiple places throughout the Psalms. And you're welcome to go there if you want, but you may just want to listen to. Let me just read a couple of the Psalms or parts of the Psalms And you could hear this in David's life, even though, again, he wasn't perfect, but this was his life. When talking about enemies, Psalm 3, many are saying of my soul, there's no salvation for him in God, but you, O Yahweh, are a shield about me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head. I was calling to Yahweh with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I laid down and slept. I awoke, for Yahweh sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000 people who all around have set themselves against me. Isn't that awesome? Because he has God as his strength, 10,000 people could be against him, and he still can get a good night rest. Can you say the same? Psalm 5, also talking about enemies. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil does not sojourn with you. The boastful shall stand before your eyes. You hate all workers of iniquity. You destroy all who speak falsehood. Yahweh abhors the man of bloodshed and deceit. But as for me, in the abundance of your loving kindness, remember, loving kindness, hesed, is that promise-keeping, loyal love of God. In the abundance of that, I will enter your house. At your holy temple, I will worship in fear of you. O Yahweh, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes. Did you hear that? Because I have foes. Because my foes are on my tail. Help me to walk in righteousness. May your way be straight before me. And let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy. And may you shelter them, that those who love your name will exult in you. For it is you who blesses the righteous one, O Yahweh, who surround him with favor as with a large shield. Such great imagery. Psalm 10. Why do you stand far off, O Yahweh? Why do you hide yourself in times of distress? And then at the end of the psalm, O Yahweh, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will strengthen their heart. You will cause your ear to give heed, to give justice to the orphan and the oppressed, so that a man who is of the earth will no longer cause terror. I could keep reading. I have a bunch of other psalms here, but you get the point. You need to trust God in every time of your life, especially in distress, and especially when you have those against you. God is to be the strength of your heart forever, always, and he will do so when you rest in him. Love the Lord with all of your life. Serve him only. And then by the time you get to the end of your life, you will walk into his presence and it will be joy all the more. Don't be a fake performance Christian. Check your heart. Don't be like Saul. This is where you can follow David's lead, who was after the heart of God. Secondly, these last ones are quicker. Secondly, rest in God's sovereign direction. He guides you. That's what he promised to do. Even when we make stupid and foolish decisions, God will still guide you. Sometimes we will end up in the enemy camp, but God will not leave you there. He'll get you out. It might hurt. He'll get you out. Now, don't wait for him to do it. David should have left a long time before then, but make the decision to get out of it and rest in God's understanding that God will direct you throughout your life. Third, and I already emphasized this earlier, but it's worth saying again, be theological in conflict. Bring God in, his character and his will. Not as a way to pound people with it and show how much you know, but because we all need to get doing what God has told us to do. That's the best way. So let's do what God has said. Let's follow God. Let's enjoy him. You've got to bring God in and his grace and his mercy and his will, especially in conflict. Finally, Give honor to where honor is due. Even with somebody's life that is a total disaster. Honor where there might be honor due, while also be discerning to learn from their life. So you can do both. And that's no doubt, I think, what the men of Jabesh Gilead were doing. They were honoring Saul for something he did for them, while not saying he was the greatest king we ever had. Okay? So we have to have some wisdom to know when to give honor because it's due, and when also to say, just because that was honoring doesn't make the rest of their life whitewashed somehow. No. We need to use wisdom in these ways. All right? That is the end of 1 Samuel. And next week, Harrison will preach. So, all right. Let me thank the Lord for it, and then I'll let the kiddos go, okay? Father, thank you for getting us through this book and sort of overview and just trying to touch on the higher points of these things. A lot more could be said, a lot more probably should, but we're thankful that we can get all of these things and understand what you've done during that time in history, and that we can learn from it, and that we can follow you in a way that is faithful. Help us to put off our sin. Help us to be theological in the ways that we think about God. That's all that means. Think about God all the time, particularly in conflict and distresses. And help us to rest in your sovereign care as you lead us through life until we see you one day. Thank you for what you've given us here. May it bear fruit in the lives of these people, of these dear folks who have been here so faithfully, and make them more like Christ and make them more in love with you. In Christ's name, amen.